Today on the Servant Leadership Podcast, we hear from Todd Henry, a leading voice on creativity, leadership, and productivity. Todd is the author of several best-selling books, including The Accidental Creative, Herding Tigers, The Brave Habit, and many others. In this episode, Todd shares the journey that led to him becoming an internationally recognized author and speaker. He shares the importance of learning to problem solve, as well as how to build daily practices that will grow your creativity and help you be a better problem solver. Join us and learn how to foster creativity through problem solving in every area of your life. Todd, thank you so much for joining today.
Chris, I am so excited to be here. This has been a long time coming. I know you emailed me a long time ago about we're thinking about maybe doing a podcast, and I was so excited when I finally got the invite. So congratulations.
Oh, well, I heard you speak at a major conference, and I had pages of notes. It was unbelievable, and just your perspective was fascinating. So I guess that gives away that you go around speaking. What people probably didn't know is you've written a lot of books. How does somebody even get into writing books and becoming a speaker? What does that background look like?
It was purely accidental, which is a little bit maybe ironic if I'm using that word properly, given the title of my first book was The Accidental Creative. But I was a creative director. I was leading teams of creative people. And this was in the early 2000s. So think, kind of pre-YouTube, definitely pre-podcasting, pre-everything. And I was really struggling to find good advice about how to lead talented creative people in the midst of what I was kind of calling the create on demand world, really struggling with trying to find good advice about that. And so I went out and started, asking a bunch of people and sort of sharing some of the things I was learning as a creative director. And this new forum called podcasting had just launched in 2005. So I thought, well, hey, I'll do that. I'll start a podcast, right? And so I did, and I shared a couple of episodes, put them on what was called iTunes at the time, which was Apple's, audio store platform at the time. And kind of forgot about it, Chris, honestly. And then about a month later, I was looking for podcasts to listen to myself. And I came across one called The Accidental Creative that was one of the top podcasts on iTunes. And I thought, in that moment, I'd stolen somebody else's name. I thought, oh no, there's already a podcast called I can't believe I didn't check first, but it was my podcast that was getting, thousands of listens at the time. And so I realized, I think I've stumbled into something here. So I continued the podcast for a handful of years, and then was contacted by several people to come speak to their company, like big Fortune 500 companies. Will you come share with us what you talked about in episode 43 or whatever? And then in the midst of that was offered a book deal from Penguin Random House for the book, The Accidental Creative, to kind of put into book form some of the things I was talking about on the podcast. And so that book, fortunately, came out in 2011, did very well. That led to my second book and my third book, my fourth, fifth, sixth, and now I'm on my seventh book, just released my seventh book. So I didn't intend to be doing this. It just sort of found me. I realized, I sort of worked my way into a niche that was valuable to people and where I had some insight. And so I'm really grateful to be doing what I do, but it was purely accidental that I ended up in this place.
I love that. Even people might think of you as the creative guy or somebody who's extremely creative, right? And that might be an extreme blessing, and it might be something that's like, I don't want to be branded there. I don't know. But as you think through it, there's creative people all over, and some people feel more creative, and some people feel less creative. How does somebody grow their creative skills from what you've seen over the years?
So I think first, definitions are really important. And as a writer, it's probably no surprise that I'm a word guy, and I love to make sure that we're using words properly. So when we use that word creativity, often people think we're talking about art, right? So they'll talk about like music or painting or design, and those are certainly creative things. But creativity, as I define it, is problem solving. That's what you're doing. If you have to solve a problem, whether that's an engineering problem, a managerial problem, a strategic problem, you have to be creative. You have to resolve uncertainty. And so I think people need to think, a lot of people who are creative for a living, they don't think of themselves as creative because they're not, quote unquote, an artist, right? So I think the first thing is just recognizing if you work with your mind, chances are you have to be creative every day because you have to solve problems. So that's the first thing. The second thing really is most people are shooting from the hip. most people are winging it in the course of their work. They don't have practices, they don't have systems, they don't have structures in place to prepare them for those moments when they need to be brilliant. And that was really what a lot of my early work was about, was I discovered with my team that I was leading, if we had certain practices in place, but before we needed to have that breakthrough idea, the odds of us having that breakthrough idea were significantly increased by preparing for that moment. And then I also saw some creative pros who were just kind of relying on their talent. They were shooting from the hip. They thought creativity was like a water spigot. You just turn it on when you need it, you turn it off when you don't, and it just always flows until one day it doesn't. And the people who had been long timers, who had been around for a long time and been contributed for a long time, they were the ones who tended to have practices in their life around things like focus, right? They tended to have blocks of time where they sat with the problem and they thought about the problem and they tried to come up with ideas. They tend to have really good practices around how they defined the problem they were trying to solve. They tended to have really good relationships, or they would talk about their work with other people and they would sort of generatively collaborate. They tended to manage their energy really well. They weren't overwhelmed with millions of things. They're really good at sort of pruning and prioritizing. They had stimulus built into their life. They would go out and they would find inspiration in unique places, right? They wouldn't just stare at the work and hope an idea pops, but they would go out and find inspiration in the world around them. And then they were really good at investing their time, not just spending their time, meaning that they would invest hours in things that may not have a payoff now, but would have a payoff down the road. So I just found that these people had practices in their life that prepared them for those moments. And so that would be my advice to anyone who is in a problem-solving role. Don't shoot from the hip, don't wing it, don't rely on your talent, because talent gets you in the game, but your practices keep you at the table. Make sure that you have practices in your life that are preparing you for those moments when you have to be brilliant, because we all do. We all have to. And we tend to think, oh, those people are just, they're just special. The people who seem to have great ideas, they're just special. They're just more talented than everybody. And talent certainly plays a role. But the thing is, like, talent without preparation, without practices, without purview, without the ability to see around corners, without the ability, the wisdom that comes from deep immersive practice, is often wasted. Talent is often wasted because people aren't prepared to take advantage of opportunities, and talent alone won't get you there. So that's my advice, I think, to people, is just make sure you have some practices in your life to prepare you for those moments when you have to have that creative breakthrough.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've heard you talk about how brilliant ideas and brilliant things often feel accidental and like people are shooting from the hip and whatnot. And really, a lot of what you've shared over the years, stuff that I followed at least, is talking about how do you repeat things, how do you scale things, and building those practices. When you share that with people, that success, these like one-time crazy successes and these one-time brilliant ideas can be repeated and scaled, do they believe you? How do people take it?
Well, some people are offended because let's face it, there are people who like to build walls around their expertise and pretend like only a select few of us are capable of creative thinking and creative thought. And we are the experts who can do what we do and nobody else can do it, right? And I understand that. I do. There are other people who think that, talent is the whole game, that if you just have enough talent, that everything else will take care of itself. And I simply do not believe that. I have met too many people who may lack a little bit in the talent area, meaning like they're not the most brilliant designer in the history of the world, and they're not the most brilliant writer in the history of the world, but their practices are what have separated them from the pack, because they're always ready at a moment's notice. They always have the energy. They always have the clarity. They're able to see clearly what we're trying to do. They're able to articulate that clearly because they've spent time ahead of time thinking it through and getting to a place where they're able to articulate those things. So people who are offended can be offended by it. I'm just telling you that, you are probably not performing. If you're shooting from the hip, if you're relying solely on your talent, you're probably underperforming your potential. And that's fine. If that's a life choice, that's, you can do that if you want. But I'm telling you that if you really want to know what you're capable of, if you really want to understand what is potentially in the cards for you, then you need to be disciplined. You need to have some practices in your life. You can't just wing it. You can't just rely on those. And by the way, I've shared this with And it's funny because I have people come to me who are at the absolute top of their industry. I mean, people who top of the music industry, top of the advertising industry, top of like name any sort of traditionally creative field. And every single one of them who are these ultra top performers. Yeah, they're very talented or you wouldn't get to the very top of your field. Every single one of them have conveyed to me what you talk about when you talk about practices is 100% true. And many of them had to crash and burn at some point early to mid-career before they realized, oh, I can't just, this is not an infinite resource for me, right? I have a finite amount of energy to spend on behalf of what's important. I have a finite amount of time. We all know we have a finite amount of time, right? But we think about our time in terms of spending, not in terms of investing. So I need to be investing some of my time in things that may not pay off today, but will pay off tomorrow. Things like developing my skills, things like trying to generate ideas proactively for my work as opposed to waiting until I have to have an idea to try to generate an idea, but getting ahead of it. You're building those practices. Things like going out and seeking stimulus in my life, dedicating time to reading and study and looking for patterns in the world around me. I mean, these are the kinds of things that people just don't do because they're never convenient and they never show up on some kind of organizational priority list, or people are jaded because so many of the gurus out there are saying, get up at 4 a.m. and do a cold plunge and eat 7 eggs and run 10 miles and then read 7 chapters of a classic and then, swim a couple laps and, run a 5K. And then you can fire up your laptop and write your 1,000 words for the day. People just love to lay these burdens on our back. And that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is just having some structure within your process that helps you to clarify your priorities, helps you to seek inspiration in your own world and sort of cultivate big thing. So I'm going on here, but big things come from small things. We tend to think that like it's all about the big idea. It's all about, these giant, once in a career kind of things that make your career. But the reality is, for many of these people I'm talking about who are at the top of their game, that big project, that big idea, the big public thing that they did was the culmination of a lot of little things that they've done. And so that just felt like the next step for them. It wasn't like, okay, now I'm going to just go, I'm just going to go, make this giant leap into the unknown. No, that was just like the next logical step, the next logical risk. So it's those daily, regular moments of practice and ritual and immersing yourself and then getting out and getting your reps in. I mean, that's really what makes great creatives great over time. And then punctuated by those occasional big moments, right? Where you saw me at Global Leadership Summit, right? Like I don't speak in front of 400,000 people every day. I mean, I'm more often speaking in front of 500 people or 300 people, right? At an event, or a couple thousand, like usually is a big event, right? But because I'd done that so many times, I was able to step on the stage and do what I did in that event. And so it's the same thing for all of us in our work. It's the daily practice that prepares us for those big inflection points.
I think that's so key because it means that it's attainable for your average person, right? And I think a lot of people are looking for the shortcut, and seeing somebody else and seeing, wow, look at where they are. I wish I was there next year. And there's a lot that happened between there and where they want to be.
Yeah. What's interesting is so I spent my early 20s in the music business, as a performer, actually. So I sang music. This was, that was 30 years ago now for me. So pre-Google, so do not try to Google it because it doesn't exist because Google didn't exist back then. But we opened for a lot of really big acts, right? I had the chance to really share a lot of time with some artists who had really become household names in many cases. And what was really interesting was over time, you started to see patterns. Just as a student of human nature, I could see patterns in some of these really big acts. And some of them were lovely to work with. Some of them were just, like a delight. They absolutely welcomed us. They would willingly share the stage. They would stand in the wings and watch us perform and would be really encouraging. And some of them were just really bitter and angry and, really protective of their turf. And I started to notice over time, the ones who were very welcoming and very warm and very encouraging were the ones who had really worked their way up through the clubs, the ones who had sort of spent years and years toiling in obscurity, playing like little clubs, probably in the same place, like opening for people like we did, right? That kind of thing. The ones who were less accommodating were the ones who sort of had that really fast J-curve trajectory where like either they just like got discovered and then suddenly were put on stage in front of a bunch of people, or, maybe like they moved to Nashville and got discovered within a couple of months and now they're like this artist. And it's really interesting because when you look in the eyes of seasoned creatives who have been around for a long time, it's like, and Steve Pressfield said this to me in an interview one time, it's almost like when you look in the eyes of someone, it's almost like when you're looking in the eyes of someone who's been to war, like two veterans, when they look in each other's eyes, like they just immediately recognize the look of someone who has, sort of been around for a while. And I feel like the same thing kind of happens in the creative industries. Like you can kind of tell when people have kind of been through it. They've put in their time, they've put in their reps, like they're seasoned, they're pros, they understand what it takes to sustain, versus those who are sort of like shooting from the hip, the sort of like young kind of like talent is endless, I will always be talented. And so I think to some extent, all of that is to say, the biggest responsibility we have, especially as young leaders and young creative pros, is to simply get our reps in, to simply go and learn as much as we can, commit ourselves to an organization, commit ourselves to the work, get our reps in, do the daily practice, just become as seasoned as we can possibly be, see as many things, solve as many problems as we can, and try to become as seasoned as possible so that when our moment comes, A, we're prepared to leverage it, but B, we're also going to be gracious toward all of those who we also need in order to help accomplish our goal, because we understand what it feels like to be in that position. When you finally have authority as a leader, if you've been the person who has served under bad leaders, if you've been the person who's, sort of felt like you've kind of been used and abused by an organization, by the time you get to the place of being a leader, you realize like, oh, I know what that feels like. I don't want to be that kind of leader. I want to be the kind of person standing in the wings, encouraging the opening act, right? I want to be the kind of person who's creating space for them to be brilliant, not trying to control them so that it feeds my ego, but I want to create space for them to be unleashed and do what they do well. That all comes with just experience and getting your reps in and becoming seasoned over time. So that's my encouragement to people. It's just like, listen, it's all useful. It's all valuable. Every experience is useful. Every experience is valuable. You just have to apply it to opportunities when they come.
Well, I think that example and those examples play perfectly into the concept of servant leadership, right? Okay. And you get to work with so many corporate teams, so many executives. How do you see them typically acting out servant leadership, or is that more rare?
I don't know if I'd say it's. I don't know if I'd say it's rare, but it's very noticeable when you come across it, right? So I think. So here's the thing: people think leadership's about being on top. Leadership's not about being on top. Leadership's about being in the middle. Every single leader is in the middle. I don't care what level of the organization you're at. If you're a mid-level manager, it's obviously you're obviously in the middle. If you're a senior leader, you're still in the middle because you're reporting to someone in the organization. And if you're the CEO of the organization, you report to the board. If you're on the board, you report to the shareholders, right? Everybody reports to someone in leadership. And the hardest part of servant leadership would be easy if you were on top, because then it's all about just, I have no pressure. I just have to, do I just have to serve the people that I'm leading. The problem is you have pressure coming from both directions. So you feel the career squeeze, you feel the personal stake in every decision that you make because somebody above you is judging your decisions and determining what your next career path might be based upon your decisions. And so you feel that squeeze while at the same time you're trying to create opportunity and serve the people beneath you and trying to be a servant leader to them and help them have a platform to show, how gifted they are, how brilliant they are. And so I think that's really sort of the challenge for a lot of leaders is that pressure of being in the middle, the pressure that's coming down from maybe somebody who's not playing the role of servant leader for them, and yet they have to turn around and play the role of servant leader for the people below them. But at the end of the day, that's what our job is as a leader. Our job is not to do the work. Our job is to lead the work. Our job is to create bounded autonomy, freedom within limits for the people on our team to be able to do what they're capable of doing. So many leaders, Chris, hire bright, sharp, talented people, and then they spend the entire time leading them, trying to turn them into little versions of themselves, right? Because they want to control the work. Because as a manager, how do we prove we were here? By the things that we did, the systems that we created, right? By the projects our team did. And so we want that work to reflect well on us. The problem is when we move in and we try to control talented people, they shut their brain off. They stop thinking because they're like, well, you're just going to tell me what to do anyway. So why should I put all the time and energy into trying to figure this out? I'm just going to wait till you tell me what to do because that's what you're going to do anyway. Right? And so the servant leader recognizes it's not about them, but it's not about them in the sense that their job is to lead the work, to create the space, to carve out the protected space for the team, the protected resources for the team to be able to do the things that they're being tasked with. And then to challenge them, to speak courage into them, to encourage them to take risks, to encourage them to grow, to develop their skills. That's really the role of the leader, is to create the space within which the team can actually do the work and to point them in the right direction, of course, right? But not to control them. I think that's the hardest thing for servant leaders, is resisting that impulse to control, because everything reflects back on the leader. And at the end of the day, you feel a little bit at the mercy of the team when you're trying to play that role of servant leader. It's much easier just to control, because then you can control the outcome. But that's not what leadership is about.
Well, and I think so many leaders are so worried about the metrics and the productivity, and they don't leave room for the creative problem solving. They don't leave room for others' opinions necessarily, because they're so focused on, well, it's all up to me, so I need to make sure that people do what I want, because then I live and die by it. You talk a lot about burnout in some of your content too, and how do you see productivity and burnout play out together? And how do people not burn out, and how do you not burn out your teams?
Yeah, well, it's a really big question. But I think, a lot of the burnout that we experience is not the result of being physically exhausted. It's the emotional, mental, sort of existential overwhelm of being in a space where you have to solve problems all the time. Because the challenge for creative people, for problem solvers, is that your work goes with you everywhere. If you're working on a factory line, at the end of the day, like you cannot physically take the factory line home with you. Like it just, you have to leave it where it is. You show up, you do your job, you clock out, you're done. Like you can't take the factory line home with you. When you do creative work, you go home and you're sitting at dinner with your family, or you go to your kid's soccer game or whatever, and that problem that you're trying to solve is always on your mind. And so I think a lot of the burnout and the overwhelm people feel is the result of the always on nature of creative problem solving. There are always uncertainties to be resolved. There are always stresses. And also, so many of us, not all of us, but most of us, don't have clear edges for our work. Meaning, I'm doing a little piece of something that's contributing to a much bigger piece, that's contributing to a bigger piece that's the final thing. But like, my work is never really done, because there's always something more to tweak, or there's a new thing coming along. And I never really get this put a stamp of, okay, I'm finished. Okay, project's finished. Let's move on to something else. It's always this kind of like constant maintenance mode that many of us are in, where we're solving little problems, putting out little fires, but we're not really ever finished. And so I think just the existential overwhelm of creative work can weigh on us. And so the way that we deal with that is by creating, this is going to surprise you based upon what I've been saying this entire time, creating structure in our life, space to be alone with our thoughts, right? Creating some punctuated rhythm in our work, so that it's not just a never-ending cycle of tasks to be done or problems to be solved, but that we have sort of some structure, some punctuated rhythm to our life and our work. You're carving out space to be alone with your thoughts, carving out space for study, carving out space to have conversations with other people about the work. And instilling those rhythms in our life makes a big difference, especially when we're in the midst of sort of equal input, equal output. We're always kind of a little bit on, even when we're supposed to be off. creating that rhythm in your life makes a huge difference emotionally, but also in terms of the quality of the work.
Yeah, that's so interesting. My mind is racing with examples from our team of just how to help people be better problem solvers. One thing that comes to mind too is that with our kids from an early age, I'm not sure many kids think about themselves as problem solvers, which probably helps. They might think of themselves as creative or athletic or whatever, but not necessarily problem solvers, the way you talk about creativity. And I wonder how much that plays into later how they're viewing their work life and other things. How much goes back to even just helping kids figure out that they're problem solvers?
I think that's a huge issue, especially, I mean, we're seeing this. So I have 3 kids. I have a senior in college, a sophomore in college, a senior in high school. When our kids were younger, and this is largely my wife's influence, she was the one who kind of pushed us. Our kids would come to us with a problem. We'd say, that's a real problem. What are you going to do about that? You probably should go figure that out. My instinct, the instinct of a lot of parents, is to just jump in and try to solve the problem for them. And I think that's been a real issue culturally, is that we have too many parents stepping in and solving their kids' problems instead of letting the kids figure them out for themselves. So I think that there is, to some extent, like when I was growing up, I think a big part of the reason I'm wired the way I am is I grew up in the middle of nowhere, like out in the country. We had to invent stuff for fun, and we did some things that were just, ridiculously dangerous. Like, we tried to build a helicopter with a lawnmower engine, literally, like the blades were going around. We're sitting on a piece of plywood with a pipe and an engine, just dumb stuff that we did. Tried to build a ruby rod laser in my garage. And today, if I ordered some of the chemicals that I tried to order back then that were shipped to me, I would be on some kind of like terrorist watch list right now, but like we did crazy stuff like that. And our parents were just like, oh, okay. All right. So I think to some extent that sense of like wonder and mystery and, sort of openness to letting kids solve their own problems and figure things out and play with ideas, I think it's so important. And I do think that a lot of the sort of guardedness and inability to think abstractly about problems comes from having your problem solved for you your entire life, right? Or having a prescribed path in front of you, and there's a right answer, there's a wrong answer, you better get the right answer. Well, no, there might be 17 different right answers, right? Maybe answers that there may be one that's more right than others, but there could be like 17 right answers. So I think it is a big issue. And that's part of why as managers, we have to provide the same level of freedom, bounded autonomy for the people on our teams. Let them try and fail and experiment and learn things and sometimes surprise us with answers that we didn't expect. Because we probably have an idea of what we think would be best. But if we've hired talented people, why not let them come up with ideas that will surprise us and delight us and send us in new directions? That's really when teams become special. That's when impact becomes multiplied.
So you've talked a little bit about structure, talked a little bit about mindset, and even just mindset throughout life. I know recently-ish, you've been coming out with the Brave Habit. Talk about that process and why you wrote it, what it is.
Yeah, so this is a book I've been working on since 2016. So interestingly, I was working on the concepts of this book, and I still had like three other books to write for my publisher, because it was a topic that I was starting to really have an interest in, and I really started noticing in culture some what I would consider both in the business space and in the political space, but also in just in culture in general, just some decisions being made that to me were under the guise of what was being called bravery, but really was more like bravado, and not really in the interest of others, really more in sort of a self-protective kind of space. And so I thought, man, somebody needs to write about this nuance between bravery and bravado. What is bravery and what does that look like? What does it look like to make brave decisions? And so I was working on this book in the background for a number of years, and finally in 2022 kind of had the space to be able to think about it a little more and actually write it. So the book just released earlier this year, The Brave Habit. And the premise of the book is there are two primary things that tend to be present when people in teams, leaders in teams make brave decisions. The first is a sense of optimistic vision, meaning that we can envision a better possible future. So we have a vision that we're navigating toward, or that we can see that would make it a better possible future. And then the second thing is a sense of agency versus powerlessness, meaning, and I believe I have the capacity to do something to help bring about that better possible future. Doesn't mean I will bring about that, but I can contribute to bringing about that better possible future. When those two things tend to be present, you tend to find brave decisions happening more consistently. And the interesting thing is that we can do things. Again, surprise, surprise, there are habits we can build, rituals we can build into our life to help us develop that sense of vision in our own life for the work that we're doing, and also to develop a sense of agency, or to cultivate agency in our life so that we're able to act in the service of that optimistic vision. So that was really the impetus for the book, was just sort of trying to encourage people to consistently on a daily basis make bravery a habit, not something that they do every so often, not something that just happens, when a big event comes along, they rush into a building to save a bunch of people, but something they can do consistently, having the right conversations, introducing the potentially dangerous ideas into, their team dynamic, doing things that other people might shy away from, but that they believe is the right thing to pursue the optimistic vision that they have for their sphere of influence.
Bravery is one of those concepts that I'm not sure people think about for themselves. Maybe it is, but I think often when we think of brave people, or I think of brave people, I think of other people. The first thoughts are not, what can I do that's brave? So much of what you've worked on with all the creativity shift to be about problem solving, and now bravery to be, how can you be brave, is retraining our minds a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think that's very true, because I think that how we, again, words are important and concepts are important, and frankly, identity is important. How we see ourselves is one of the more critical things about how we spend our time on this planet. And we wear all kinds of labels and all kinds of names that are not meant for us. A lot of people go through their life wearing the name coward. That's just something that they wear as a name because somebody once upon a time convinced them that they were the kind of person who wasn't up to the task or whatever. They shied away one time from doing the right thing, and so for the rest of their life they wear that name coward. And so I think in some ways, like, we have to retrain ourselves to think differently about our lives, our responsibilities, our work.
See, I know that you're helping people retrain their mind and go through that at a corporate level. You're helping with your books, you're helping with your speaking. Well, our audience might not know is that you're also doing it through your podcast. Talk about your podcast a little bit with us.
Yeah, so the podcast started in 2005. It was originally called The Accidental Creative. We just this year, speaking of making brave choices, we got rid of 18 years of back catalog and started over with episode 1 in January, which is kind of crazy, actually, now that I think about it, and I'm saying that out loud. But yeah, it's called Daily Creative with Todd Henry. We're on like episode 34 now of the podcast. And it's really a podcast that explores what it looks like to be brave, focused, and brilliant every day in your life and your work as a leader and as a creative pro. And that's really what we're trying to help people be every day, is to be brave in their work, to be focused in terms of how they approach their work, and then to be brilliant, to do great work, because that's what we're all hopefully here to do. So yeah, Daily Creative with Todd Henry is the name of the podcast.
Real quick, just to touch on that brilliant, because you brought it up earlier, it has to do with what your podcast is about. Can you explain at a high level the Brilliant Engine?
Yeah, so the Brilliance Engine is really a 7-part process. It's funny, how sometimes you can work on things for years and years and years, and you don't realize that you're working within a system, and then suddenly, all of a sudden, one day it's like click. And my business partners and I were, over the course of this summer, we were really sort of looking at what is the Marvel universe of Todd Henry's work, right? Like, as you look at the last 15 15 years, 20 years, and you look at the 7 books I've written, and we realize that there are these 7 core gears, these 7 parts that kind of all play together, starting with like, finding order in your life and igniting drive in your life, and then, learning to stand out and learning to play nice and learning how to get clear with the people you're collaborating with, and then leading well, which is like herding tigers, and being brave, right, which is brave habit. We realize that there are these 7 gears that all kind of play together, and when they're all working well in concert with one another, then it produces inevitable brilliance in your life and your work, or in your organization. And when one of the gears is out of whack, just like if a gear is out of whack in a car, right, you're gonna struggle, you're gonna have problems. And so that's the concept of what we've been calling the Brilliance Engine, which is a way to kind of make brilliance inevitable in your life and in your work. Is if you get these 7 gears functioning properly, then you significantly increase the likelihood of a brilliant outcome. You make brilliant inevitable as opposed to accidental, which is, I think, in many organizations, it's like, hey, we had another brilliant outcome, great, and then, okay, let's hope it happens again. So the goal again is to kind of systemize that and try to make brilliance inevitable.
Well, and I could be totally off on this, but I think you obviously have a lot of great books and books that I've enjoyed. One thing that makes this one a little bit unique, if I'm right, is that there's a workbook that people can actually work through alongside. I think that's so important because one of the things that I've loved about you over the years is you're all about action steps, and you've got a lot of action steps, and it's not like burdensome action steps, but it's so what, right? And it's the do this. The workbook takes it to a whole nother level. How did that come about?
Well, that was something I really because this is such a highly personal book. I wanted it to feel personal, like a journey, like a personal journey people were taking, as opposed to just, okay, it's an interesting book I read. It got some new concepts, things I can go share with my team and kind of move on. I wanted it to be transformative and to form habits. And so that was kind of the impetus for doing the workbook, and also had some flexibility I haven't had in the past because the Brave Habit specifically, I decided, which again, another act of bravery, right? Because we had some opportunity to traditionally publish the book, but I wanted it to be short, 150 pages, actionable, easy to read. And I wanted to be able to use the material, the content wherever I wanted, in whatever form I wanted, because this is really a missional book for me. As much as any of my books have been, this is probably the most missional book that I've done, in the sense that I feel a real need to get this message out into the world. And so I was able to create a workbook because I was able to use the material wherever I wanted, right? And do whatever I wanted with it. And so I had some flexibility and some freedom this time as well that I haven't had in the past, which is encouraging. So yeah, I'm glad that you found that useful, because that was kind of the whole purpose of creating a workbook, was to make it very actionable for people and to really make people sit with the ideas and the questions and the prompts and the concepts a little more deeply.
Yeah, I think the whole Brilliance Engine piece, where it really is like cogs, right? The way you kind of portray it is so key, because you can easily tell when one is removed, everything else is going to struggle or just totally stop.
Right.
And they all need to be functioning well to keep momentum moving forward, and just the whole concept. I love it. I want to ask you 10 rapid fire questions, if that's okay. Where you just say the first thing that comes to your mind, and there is no right or wrong. Okay? Who's the first?
Okay, so you say, okay.
Whatever you say goes. Who's the first person you think of when I say servant leadership?
Let me talk through my thought process here, right? The first person who comes to mind is John Maxwell, because John Maxwell has been like talking about this concept of servant leadership for years and years and years. And so that's probably the first person who just kind of like immediately comes to mind, because he's the one who sort of, in my mind, is sort of like popularized, the idea of, and then sort of has been speaking about it for so long. But I would say probably in my life, I had a leader in my life who I significantly failed at one point in doing an organizational restructure, and they pulled me aside and they said, "All right, you failed. Let's talk about what that means, right? And let's talk about how we get you through this and get you to another place, help you learn from this and go to the next place. And to me, that was a tremendous act of servant leadership, because the easier thing to do would have just been to say, okay, you failed. Let's move on. Let's put somebody else in charge of this and try to figure out, how we move forward. But instead, the act of servant leadership was to pull me aside and to have that conversation to help me get better, which was very inconvenient for this leader to do that. And so I think on a personal level, that story really sort of illustrates for me what servant leadership actually looks like, which is doing the inconvenient thing for yourself in order to help the other person become better in their own right. So sorry, it took me a while to get to that answer, but I was trying to think of okay, the first person I think of when I think of the phrase, but then really in my own life, that was probably one of the most impactful moments of servant leadership in my own life.
Wow. Both of those are great. All right, what are the 5 words that most describe you?
Arms dealer for creative revolution.
Love that. Favorite author or book?
My favorite author is Thomas Merton, who was a mystic and monk who was cloistered outside of Louisville, Kentucky. He wrote a book called New Seeds of Contemplation this probably had one of the more, probably has had as much impact on me as any book in my life. My favorite business author is Seth Godin. And Seth was one of the first people I had on the podcast back in 2007, I think was my first interview with him. And he's had a tremendous impact. As a matter of fact, Purple Cow is one of the reasons why I started my podcast to begin with, which was a book that came out in 2004.
Favorite movie?
My favorite movie of all time is probably the movie Cinderella Man, which is a true story of a boxer during the Great Depression who went through a lot of ups and downs. I am a sucker for a good redemption story. I'm a sucker for a good underdog story, and it is both of those.
Favorite food?
My favorite food is probably, there's another tricky one. My favorite food is probably, I'm not going to lie, it's probably steak. I love a good steak, actually.
Favorite thing to do in your free time?
I love to read. I have a stack of books over next to my chair, so that's one of my favorite things, is to read or to watch my heartbreaking Cincinnati Bengals play football.
Oh boy, that has been hard. Surprising fact about you?
I mentioned it earlier, but I was in the music business as a performer for a number of years in my early 20s, which is kind of funny now looking back on it, but spent a big chunk of time trying to make it in the music business. And as I like to say, was as successful as I could be without being successful in the music business. That's basically the way I describe what happened. And eventually met a girl and decided, maybe it's time to move on from this living in a tin can, going up and down the road kind of thing.
Favorite place you've ever been?
I loved Istanbul. Was absolutely beautiful. And then my wife and I love Park City, Utah. We just think it's beautiful. We love the mountains. We love to go when it's warm-ish in the summer, not so much in the winter when it's ski season, but we love to go and hike in the summer.
Where's somewhere you want to go that you haven't been?
I've not been to Italy, which is kind of surprising because I've been all over the world, but I've not yet been to Italy. So I would love to go to Italy.
Okay. And finally, what's the best advice you've ever gotten?
The best advice I've ever gotten is get your reps in. I had a leader early on when I was first teaching, actually, in any capacity, who said, you just need to get in front of people whenever you can. If it's a group of 5 people, get in front of them and treat them like it's 5,000 people. But you need to get your reps in. Just go in and do the thing that you think you want to do. And that's really what podcasting was for me from a teaching perspective. I had done hundreds of podcasts before I ever stepped foot on the stage and taught any of the concepts that are in my podcasts. And because of that, I practiced speaking so much that, and teaching so much, by the time I just stepped on the stage, it was like, oh, I've talked about this stuff a million times, right? So, get your reps in is probably the best advice.
Wow. Well, Todd, I'm so excited for people to be able to listen to this, hear some of your background, be able to go check out some of your work. And thank you for being on. What a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And congrats on the great work you're doing, and congrats on the arc of the podcast. It's really exciting.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Servant Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss an update. Be sure to check out the servantleadershippodcast.org for more updates and additional bonus content.